Hi students, good morning and welcome back to the second semester of English 2. We will be beginning this semester with a survey of another novel, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, before we start the novel, it's important to gain some background information on the literary movement that this novel was the hallmark of, really. Our author F. Scott Fitzgerald, and a lot of the other really important things that were going on in literature during this time. So let's get started. So, what major political, social, or cultural events can you think of that shaped the United States between 1914 and 1945? So, let's think about our American history for a second here. What do you think major things were going on during this time that would really influence the American people? Well, several things were going on, big things that had a profound effect on the American people and on art, literature, and music. So here is a brief timeline from 1890 to 1940. So in the 1890s, it was the beginnings of symbolism in literature and impressionism in art. So we've talked about symbolism quite a bit this year in literature. So we know that it is when something is meant to represent something else, usually some sort of abstract idea or feeling. In 1895, Mr. Sigmund Freud first comes on the scene and he is studying psychoanalysis. And then in 1900, he publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. Now, Sigmund Freud is considered the father of modern psychology. He is the person that spearheaded the id, ego, and superego. So this is when people first started really understanding the complexities of the mind. And then here is a huge important event from 1914 to 1918. This was World War One, which was the catalyst for the disillusionment in the themes of fragmentation that will become very prevalent in literature. And we'll discuss that more in a little bit. But this was known as the Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, and millions of people died. In 1915, here's a name you'll know, Albert Einstein publishes his general theory of relativity. In 1922, we had some very important hallmark publications, including James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. We'll discuss The Wasteland a little bit more here in a little bit. Another huge event I want you to take note of, 1929 was the Wall Street crash. This is what brought about the Great Depression when the stock market crashed. And it was a horrible event throughout America that lasted for several years, and it deeply impacted every single citizen and the general cultural consciousness of the United States. In 1930, it was the rise of fascism and political turmoil across Europe, which we know with the rise of fascism, this led to the rise of Adolf Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany. And then finally in 1939, Germany would invade Poland and it would become the beginning of World War II in Europe. And then we're going to start having a transition toward postmodern thought. So everything from the 1890s up until 1939, this is kind of considered the modernist era. And then after World War II is the postmodern era. So the Great Gatsby falls into the modernist era, and that's what I want us to focus on right now, and the features and the feelings of the American public during this time period. So, how do you think living through events like this would impact art, literature, and music developed during this time? Understand and recognize that history shapes really everything. So, all the art, literature, and music of an entire generation has resulted from living through World War One, living through the Great Depression, the stock market crash, the rise of fascism, seeing what was going on in Europe, This influenced everyone. It was not something that could be ignored. And this is what contributed to the modernist era. And a lot of things were going on during this time. So, what exactly is modernism? So, modernism involves bold experimentation and style, breaking away from the tradition, particularly in poetry. Constant questioning of life, but offering no answers. People during this time felt genuinely lost. They didn't know if there were any answers to life. What is life? They just watched an entire generation of men be nearly wiped out during World War One. And so people had a lot of questions that they did not know how to answer anymore. And there was a lot of disillusionment in the American dream. People felt lost. People felt confused. Now, I do know disillusionment is a little bit of a difficult word. Disillusionment refers to realizing that something is not as great as you once believed it to be. So I want you to hold on to that thought, especially that word disillusionment, as we move into The Great Gatsby, because that is going to become a very pivotal word for the book itself. Believing that understanding, that something is not as great as you once believed it to be. All right, so in the modernist era, we had three different important things going on. So, first of all, we had Imagist poetry, which was from 1912 to 1927. These were really short poems that used just ordinary everyday language. And so they were breaking away from longer poetic forms from the 19th century. And it was all about creating clear images. We'll talk about this more here in a moment. The Harlem Renaissance from 1920 to 1930. This is a phrase you've probably heard before. It was the first major art movement by African American artists, centering on the lives of African Americans, a significant influence throughout the 20th century. This is where jazz, the entire musical genre of jazz, was first established. And it all started in Harlem, New York. That's why it's called the Harlem Renaissance. And then we also have the what's referred to as the Lost Writers from 1914 to 1930. So you see that 1914, this is around the time that World War One began. And these were a bunch of writers in America who were really coming of age, becoming adults post World War One. Some of them fought in World War One, some of them didn't, but all of them were affected by it. And as they came through World War One in the roaring 20s, they really were upset with America. They were upset with the aftermath of World War One and the ideology in America of just this business as usual. Everything's back to normal. America is great. Everybody's great. They felt like it was very hypocritical, and they were not happy about it. And so many of them chose to live in London or Paris. They immigrated from the United States. And so most of these pivotal writers from the modernist movement were not living in the United States at this time. All right, so let's talk about some Imagist poetry. Imagist poems are very short poems. Sometimes they can be as short as only 2 lines. And the purpose of Imagist poetry is to use vivid language to convey a single image in the reader's mind in detail. This is a very short poem known as Fog by Carl Sandburg. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. So we have a very short poem here. We don't have any specific structure in the length per line or any this is only one stanza, but we can see that this entire little vivid poem is all about just conveying an image of what fog looks like as it rolls into a city. And this is exactly what Imagist poetry was, conveying a single image in a very short poem. All right, now let's spend a minute with the Harlem Renaissance. The most famous writer of the Harlem Renaissance is likely Langston Hughes. I Too is one of his most beautiful poems, highlighting the African American's experience during his lifetime. This is called I Too. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. And then finally, a clip from The Lost Writers, of which our author of The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, is considered one of the lost writers. He spent most of his time in Paris rather than in the United States, even though he was born in Missouri. The greatest poet of the modernist era is considered T.S. Eliot. In fact, he wrote what is considered the greatest poem of the entire 20th century, known as The Wasteland. The Wasteland really encapsulates the entire general feeling of what it was like living in post World War One in a post World War One world. It's a poem about sadness and emptiness. It describes a broken world where people feel lost and disconnected from each other and their traditions. He uses strong images like a dry and barren land to show how both the world and people's hearts feel empty. The poem jumps around between different voices and stories, mixing old myths like the Odyssey and even the Bible and the Canterbury Tales and modern life to show how all anyone is doing is just trying to search and find meaning in this new reality. And even though the poem seems sad, it also suggests that there is hope and healing possible if we can all work together to rebuild and find purpose again. Now, The Wasteland is a pretty long poem. It's broken into multiple parts, and it's hard to pull out a single little section that would make sense. So I have an excerpt here from another one of Eliot's very famous modernist works known as The Hollow Men. This is the end of The Hollow Men. And this is Miss Catherine's personal favorite poem. But I just love this. So this poem centers around referring to people as basically little straw people, like a little straw doll. And once again, kind of going back to the feelings during the in the Wasteland poem about the emptiness that people feel. So this is the end of The Hollow Men. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is, life is. For thine is the, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Ugh, every time I read it, it gives me chills. So you can really see the hopelessness of the way people feel after World War One, the search for meaning, and just the struggle people were feeling in general. All right, so now that we have an idea of what modernist thought looked like, now let's pose a different question to ourselves. What do you hear and think to yourself when you hear the phrase American dream? And this is a question we're going to keep coming back to as we read The Great Gatsby. What is the American dream? And do you believe that it is attainable? So, generally, the American dream is the idea that with hard work and determination, everyone living in the United States can achieve success and prosperity. Do you think this is true? And this is something that I want you to really think about, because this is a question that is really the entire point of The Great Gatsby centers around: is the American dream real, and is it attainable? Especially after think all these people that lived through the Great Depression and the stock market crash and people losing everything. Is the American dream attainable, and has the American dream changed? So, with that in mind, let's talk about our author now, Mr. F. Scott Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a modernist writer of the lost generation, as I said, and he is actually known to have coined the very popular term the Jazz Age. And his style is known for being very poetic and lyrical. He's a beautiful writer. I think you're really going to enjoy The Great Gatsby and the way that he writes. So, who was the man? Fitzgerald was born in 1896 to a middle class family in Missouri that struggled financially. His father was an unsuccessful businessman, and they were forced to rely on his mother's inheritance to make ends meet. He would go on to enroll in Princeton University, but he would end up flunking out because he spent most of his time trying to make friends and gain popularity rather than working on his academic pursuits. He would also go on to enlist in World War One, but the armistice, the end of World War One, arrived just as he was preparing to ship out. And Fitzgerald regretted that his whole life, that he was not able to contribute to the war. During this time, if you didn't fight in the war, it was considered shameful to a lot of men to have not participated. He initially also struggled in relationships because of his poor background. Fitzgerald writes in his one of his journals that a family member of a previous girlfriend was even heard to have said, "Poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls." He would eventually go on to marry Zelda Sayre, and they would have a really rocky marriage due to alcoholism, financial difficulties, and mental health issues. After the Great Depression, Fitzgerald lost a lot of popularity that he had initially gained because most of his works featured the flapper lifestyle of the 1920s. And after the Great Depression, that was absolutely obsolete and gone. So it wasn't as relatable anymore. So then he would eventually die in relative obscurity at the tender age of 44. Now we recognize that The Great Gatsby is considered one of the greatest American novels of the 20th century, if not of all time. So let's talk about Gatsby for a little bit. It was published in 1925 and it didn't have immediate success, but it is now considered to be absolutely foundational to the American literary voice. One of the reasons that Gatsby is so successful is Fitzgerald was quoted once to say that his works are a little bit semi autobiographical. So he puts a lot of himself into his work. So as we read The Great Gatsby, I want you to consider what we have just learned about Fitzgerald's life and his struggles. And I want you to think about the characters that we're going to discover and think what parts of himself do you think Fitzgerald has embedded in his characters? All right, so these are some major themes that we're going to be discussing over and over again in Gatsby. Of course, as we've already discussed, the American dream. That's the big one. Everything's going to come back to the American dream. Wealth, a class divide, and identity, a struggle for identity and who we are. Another big thing we are going to discuss throughout the novel is symbolism. We know that symbolism is very big in the modernist era. Many things represent something else, and these are the four big symbols that we will see in The Great Gatsby. One of them is even featured on the cover. We will have the green light, East egg, and West egg, and these are not literal eggs, these are places. Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's eyes, and they are actually the eyes on the cover of the novel, and the Valley of Ashes. And of course, you don't have any idea what these things are now, but these are things that we will discuss often throughout the story. All right, so to wrap up, the biggest thing I want you to take away as we read The Great Gatsby is I want you to consider what the novel says about the American dream. It's all about the American dream. Think about the themes of identity, class divide, wealth, and how that relates to the American dream and whether or not it's attainable and whether or not the American dream has changed. All right, so I look forward to a great novel study. I hope you guys enjoy Gatsby, and let's get started.